Fans, what's going on? It's Anthony Cosenza with the Orange and Black Insider. Episode 3 is in the books. This show is moving forward, and we are uh, excited about all of the growth that we've seen over the past couple of episodes, and there's more news on that. And part of that growth is in bringing in our very first guest in this podcast, and it is Ted Glover from the Daily Norseman. He is the editor over there. He does a lot of different stuff, and he's going to help us talk about the upcoming preseason game number 1 with the Bengals and the Vikings. Again, it's Anthony Cosenza. I'm joined with my usual co-host Scott Schulze and Connor Howe. But Ted Glover, I'm going to let you talk about yourself, your role with the Daily Norseman, and some of the ways that Bengals fans and other Vikings fans who might be tuning in can follow you and what you're doing at the website.
Thanks, Anthony, and hello, Bengal Nation. Good to see you, or meet you, or talk with you. Kind of feel like we're making history here, which I don't know if that's a good thing since I'm your first guest.
You should feel very important. VIP, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Answer to a trivia question in 20 years.
There you go. Yeah.
No, like Anthony said, my name's Ted Glover. I write for the Daily Norseman, the Minnesota Vikings SB Nation site. You can find the website on Twitter at Daily Norseman. You can find me on Twitter at Purple Buckeye. I'm a Vikings and Ohio State fan. Long story there. Nobody wants to hear it, I'm sure. We also have a podcast. We actually have a couple podcasts over on Daily Norseman. The one I'm involved with, we just started up. It's called Roughing the Podcast with one of the other front page writers, Di Murphy. You can find that show on Twitter at Rough the Podcast, and our other podcast is Norse Code at Norse Code DN. So we actually have a couple different podcasts over there. I write and do the podcast and talk about all things Minnesota Vikings.
Well, thanks for joining us. Yeah, I mean, you like I said, you should feel very special, Ted. I mean, you are the very first guest on this podcast, so we are excited to have it. It's kind of a big deal. Yep. We are very excited to have you on. Absolutely. No, thanks for the time. I appreciate it. So I'm going to start off with, obviously, there are many, many, many connections with the Bengals and the Vikings, and a lot of them stemming from Mike Zimmer, the former Bengals defensive coordinator, who is now the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, landed there for the 2014 season. He's been there a couple years. The Vikings went to the playoffs last year. Just overall impressions of him as a coach. I know a lot of Bengals fans really loved what he brought to the team. Obviously, he and Marvin Lewis built up the defense here. It looks like he's doing the same with the Vikings. Talk about the culture change, if any, that Mike Zimmer has brought, and some of the positive steps you've seen the franchise take since he's taken over.
I love Mike Zimmer. I don't know if you guys had heard, but he just got a contract extension, I think, last week. I think it was a 3-year deal, but the Vikings never really released the terms of that deal. But I hope he's the Minnesota Vikings coach for a long time. He's brought in an accountability that I don't know that the Vikings had under Leslie Frazier. Leslie Frazier was a good guy. Loved by his players, well respected among his peers in the NFL. But towards the end of the Frazier regime, there was just this lack of enthusiasm, I guess, if you will, and a lack of accountability. I don't know if that's the right word, but there were excuses every week. The Vikings, you'd watch them collapse in the 59th minute and lose a game, and you'd hear the normal, typical end of game press conferences, your typical Frazier stuff as well. We saw some good things on tape, and we'll correct our mistakes, and now we'll move on to whoever our next opponent is. And Mike Zimmer is the antithesis of that. He is a fiery guy, an emotional guy that, for a modern day NFL coach, wears his emotions on his sleeve about as much as an NFL coach does, and it's refreshing. He'll call players out and say, "Hey, this guy does some things really good, but he needs to work on this." Or a former player that they cut at the end of last year had some early season injuries, kind of in the doghouse, and he had the famous "you can't make the club in the tub" comment about the guy. And he one of his, I'm sure you guys know these Zimmer isms, if you will, is don't tell me about the baby, show or don't tell me about the labor, show me the baby. So I
Yeah.
mean, he just is this quote machine that you just love, and he brought this enthusiasm and this attitude that the Minnesota Vikings were sorely lacking, especially on defense.
Ted, I just want to say thanks for coming on. There is two questions actually that I wanted to ask you about the Vikings now that they are in town practicing with the Bengals. And the first question is a local kid, Kyle Rudolph, who grew up in Cincinnati, went to Elder High School, was a high pick, a lot of expectations, just never seemed to be able to stay healthy. Now that it seems like he's healthy again, he finally played 16 games last year. What are Vikings' expectations for Kyle Rudolph this year?
They're very high. The Vikings signed Rudolph to I think it was a $25 million extension right before or right as camp was beginning in 2014. And quite frankly, he hasn't lived up to that money. In 2014, he was injured. He missed 8 or 9 games. I'd have to look it up to be sure, but he missed a fair amount of time. Last year, he was healthy for most of the season, but for good parts of the season, the tight end position, and it wasn't really just Rudolph, it was whoever they were playing at tight end, just sort of disappeared. You could look at a couple different reasons why. The Vikings were a very run-oriented team. When they went back to pass protection wasn't very good at all, and a lot of times the tight end they were using as an extra blocker. So there weren't as many opportunities as I don't think the Vikings would have liked. But Minnesota went ahead in the offseason and they made a couple steps in free agency and in the draft to improve the offensive line, and hopefully that will get Kyle Rudolph back to the pass catching, playmaking tight end that they envisioned him to be when they drafted him.
Speaking of tight ends, I know that Norv Turner has kind of been known as almost a tight end whisperer, and obviously he's the offensive coordinator in Minnesota. And as a San Diego resident, I can say that most Charger fans and most people who have ever encountered him don't think of him that highly. What's your opinion on Turner? Because I know that there's you have to have something to be an NFL offensive coordinator, let alone head coach at one point in his career. So, do you like him? And what about him would you say is the pros and the cons?
The pros. I mean, I get why Chargers fans don't like him. There are some guys that are great assistants in the NFL and just for whatever reason aren't meant to be head coaches. Is Norv Turner that guy? I don't know. He had kind of a run of success as the Chargers head coach, kind of a little bit of a run of success as the Redskins head coach. But yeah, I can see why Chargers fans soured on him. I like him compared to what the Vikings had prior to Norv Turner arriving. I think he's done a good job with the Vikings offense until the first year. Last year, I don't know that you can blame a lot of the issues on Norv Turner. There's some things that frustrate me about him. He has this penchant for example, the Vikings will be in the middle of a pretty good drive. 6-7 plays. They started deep in their own territory. They're now on the opponent's 30-35. Things are clicking, and they're looking like a well-oiled machine. And for whatever reason, Norv Turner will call this weird trick play that either loses 10 yards, causes a fumble, and now the drive is just shot. That's kind of irritating. I think he relies too much on running the ball with Adrian Peterson, or he did last year. Again, that might be attributed to the fact that the passing attack he likes to use is more of a 5 to 7 step drop, deep pass, medium and deep throws, and that really wasn't a successful part of Minnesota's passing game last year because of protection issues and Teddy Bridgewater, deep ball accuracy. But I think, in the offseason, the Vikings brought in Tony Sperano, former Dolphins coach, Raiders interim coach, offensive line coach, and he's been a guy that's looked at their offense and both Zimmer and Turner have said, look, it was a good thing that we brought him in, because he gives us a new look at things, a new way to look at things, new wrinkles we can put in. So I like Turner, but I also like the fact that they brought in Tony Sperano, because I think he's going to bring a fresh set of eyes, if you will, to the offense, and be able to maybe add some things to the Vikings offense we hadn't seen.
Yeah, there must be something in the water in South Bend with their tight ends. Talented guys can catch passes and everything, but they can't stay healthy. It's kind of a weird weird stigma as they get to the NFL. Again, it's Anthony Cosenza, Scott Schulze, Connor Howe, and we are joined by Ted Glover of the Daily Norseman on the Orange and Black Insider. Thanks again, Ted, for your time. I think, again, we talked about connections between the Bengals and the Vikings as we open this segment. Talk about Andre Smith. Obviously he was a free agent. He was with Cincinnati for quite some time. He had his roller coaster of a career here. There were times where he was an absolutely dominant tackle, times where he couldn't stay healthy, and times where he just didn't play very well against certain pass rushers. So what has he looked like in camp? If I remember correctly, I think Phil Lodeholt recently retired, who might have been competing with some time with him. I could be wrong about that, so feel free to correct me on that. But what have been the impressions of Andre Smith so far?
An upgrade. And that was, like you mentioned, Phil Lodeholt, the longtime right tackle for the Vikings, blew out his Achilles. First or second preseason game last year, missed the entire year. Was supposed to come back and compete with T.J. Clemmings, who replaced Lodeholt last year, and then Andre Smith. Phil just said he couldn't do the things he needed to do to play in the NFL, so he retired a week or two before camp started. So what was supposed to be a pretty spirited competition for the starting right tackle job kind of went to Smith by default, because Clemmings, although he gave it a heck of an effort last year, he just was not ready for the NFL. Struggled immensely at times, and although the 1 year of experience helped him, I just think he still needs some more time before he can compete for a starting job. As to Smith, he's looked good for the most part. He's had kind of an inconsistent camp at times, which you kind of chronicled with his days in Cincinnati. I was personally excited about the Smith signing because he had the greatest combine gif ever with the Moob 40-yard dash way back in the day. I mean, that's just a gift that keeps on giving if you're a blocker.
Yep, absolutely.
He was
But in all
Moob
seriousness,
for a long time here.
Save that one on your phone for any time the Vikings have a negative run play.
All right, I will do that. But no, I think the Vikings brought him in to be an upgrade, and he's healthy, and he's also a guy that they brought in on a 1 year deal. So they're also doing kind of a prove it year for Smith to prove to us that you can play. And I bet if he does, the Vikings will look to get him to a contract extension.
No, we were just talking a player that the Bengals had. One player the Bengals might have had was a wide receiver. The Bengals were obviously looking wide receiver this year in the draft, and there was that huge run of wide receivers that went right before them. You had Corey Coleman, then you had Will Fuller and Josh Doxson, and the Vikings took Laquan Treadwell. And one thing I was looking at, which kind of surprised me, is the Vikings have now taken 4 wide receivers in the first round from the SEC in the last 10 or 12 years, with Troy Williamson back in 2005, Percy Harvin, Cordarrelle Patterson, and then Laquan Treadwell this year. So the question I had is kind of based on the success or somewhat success of some of those guys. What have the fans seen in camp, or the team seen in camp, from Treadwell that has them maybe more excited than they may have seen from Williamson or Patterson? And that, hey, this could be the guy we've been looking for?
Well, it's kind of I hate to joke, but it's kind of an easy comparison, Treadwell to Troy Williamson, because Laquan Treadwell can catch the ball, which is a pretty important requirement for a wide receiver. For Cordarrelle Patterson, it's kind of a frustrating thing. When he was drafted in 2013, I think it was, he had that run at the end of the season. The Vikings were in the midst of a terrible year, but that last month of the season, Patterson was one of the leading receivers in the NFL, and that never translated to 2014 and 2015 for a myriad of reasons. He's kind of been in Mike Zimmer's doghouse. As you guys well know, for Mike Zimmer, if you're not going to get by on talent, you're gonna participate. You're gonna have to know your job. You're gonna have to know what you're doing. And I think Patterson, and he kind of admitted this, is that he just tried to use just get by on his natural ability, which you can do at a place like Tennessee, even in a conference as good as the SEC. But in the NFL, you can't do that. And he didn't put in the time and the effort and what was asked of him. I mean, for example, last offseason, the Vikings, by multiple reports, had asked Michael Irvin to work with Patterson in the offseason, and Irvin goes back to the Dallas days with Mike Zimmer. And Patterson said, you know what, no, I'm going to pass on that. And that just really said a lot to a lot of people about, where Patterson was. And this offseason, he said he rededicated himself, and by all accounts, he worked hard. Mike Zimmer praised him in the offseason, and the very first day of camp, he hurt his shoulder, and he missed almost a full week of practice. So with Treadwell, I think what you get is a big body. He's a big guy. He's not this 4.240 guy, but the Vikings offense doesn't need that. They need a guy that is good at route running, that will be at the spot he's supposed to be when the ball is released, and will catch the ball and go for contested balls. I think you talk about Fuller and Doxson and the other guys in the first round. I think Treadwell, with his skill set, he's not the fastest guy, but he is the guy that is best suited for this offense, and I think he's going to be a huge asset to the Vikings in this year and years to come.
Yeah, I was definitely pretty jealous of the Vikings when they grabbed Treadwell. He was one of the guys I was really high on. A little bit unrelated question, but the Vikings seem to be courting the Bengals safety George Iloka in free agency, and obviously the Bengals were able to lock him up to a pretty relatively team-friendly deal for what the safeties in the market were getting paid for. And the Vikings, I know they signed Sendejo before, or however you pronounce it, before the courtship of Iloka, but they were still, it seemed, courting Iloka even though they had Sendejo I think he's making $4 million a year. So I'm just curious. You obviously have Harrison Smith. I think adding Iloka could have potentially given the Vikings, if not the best safety duo in the entire NFL, one of the best. Obviously, it has to be frustrating, but do you think? I mean, what are your thoughts on the situation? Do you think it was a huge loss? Do you think it was something that they can overcome? Just what are your thoughts?
Overcome, yeah, they can overcome it. I mean, the Vikings had a top 5 or 10 defense with Andrew Sendejo last year. The Iloka thing was really puzzling to me. Going into the offseason, the one huge thing I thought the Vikings needed to address was the safety position opposite Smith. Michael Griffin doesn't really seem to be that guy. I mean, unless it's 2010 or 2011. Iloka was out there. There was also a couple other safeties out there that I thought the Vikings might try and make a run at, but they didn't, and instead they turned around and like you mentioned, gave Andrew Sendejo a pretty healthy contract extension. I was not a fan of that. Although that said, he's not bad in run support. His weak area is always going to be pass coverage. What the Vikings did do in the draft was draft a guy out of Clemson named Jaron Kearse, who a lot of people thought would be a top pick going into the draft, and for whatever reason, he had a terrible year at Clemson in 2015, and fell to the 7th round when the Vikings got him. And the word out of camp is that Kearse has been pretty good. And he was actually working in that joint practice today with the Bengals. He was actually working with part of the first team defense for a while. So I think Sendejo is going to be the guy. I think, however, if they're going to look to replace him, it's either going to be Kearse or maybe Anthony Harris, another backup safety on the Vikings. But yeah, they're going to go with Sendejo for now, and why they didn't go after Iloka, that was not frustrating, not just for me, but for a lot of Vikings fans.
Again, we're joined by Ted Glover of the Daily Norseman, part of the SB Nation network of blogs, the Vikings blog. Ted, we'll kind of close with this, and you may have a number of observations and things to answer with my question here, but as we mentioned, obviously both teams, the Vikings and the Bengals, are opening up their preseason with the first game against each other in Cincinnati. So what are you looking for from the Vikings perspective in terms of outcomes of the game and what you hope the Vikings get out of it, as well as maybe some matchups that you'll be looking for, even though starters may not play all that long in this first game?
First and foremost, and this is for both teams, I don't want to see anybody get hurt. I
saw no more of that. No more of that, please.
Yeah, I saw you guys had a defensive tackle hurt today. Hopefully it's not serious. But what I'm looking at is primarily the offensive line, and Matt Khalil and Andre Smith. You know, they brought in Alex Boone. Looks like John Sullivan is going to start, and Brandon Fusco is going to start at right guard, or is projected to be. But the weak links last year were right tackle and left tackle. So I want to see how Matt Khalil performs. I want to see how Andre Smith performs. And then I want to see the Vikings, practice, some deep stuff, because that was the main legitimate criticism of Teddy Bridgewater last year, an inaccurate deep ball. So if they're going to take some shots downfield with the offense, I would like to see that and see how that goes. But overall, predictions for the game, I don't care. It's preseason. I'm just excited that football's back. And then I'll think, once the third string guys are in to start the third quarter, yeah, okay, let's get on to the regular season. But yeah, no injuries. I'm looking for Matt Khalil. I'd like to see what Laquan Treadwell does as well, just to see his debut. And then the rookie Mackenzie Alexander. On defense, I mentioned Alexander, but also Trey Waynes, who was the first-round pick last year, cornerback out of Michigan State. Didn't really play a whole lot. They really brought him along slow. And it looks like he might be neck and neck with your old friend Terrence Newman, who had a really good year with the Vikings last year, has not really looked good in camp. And Waynes may have a legitimate chance here. With Newman not making the trip, I think he's nursing a hip injury. With Newman not making the trip, it looks like Waynes has an opportunity to vault him in the depth chart. So we'll see how that goes as well.
Awesome. Great stuff, Ted. I appreciate you coming on the show. I know it's a little bit of a short notice, but appreciate your time. And just one more time, where can people follow you either on Twitter and find some of your stuff as well as your podcast that you mentioned earlier?
You can find my rantings and ravings in electronic print on dailynorseman.com, which is the SB Nation Minnesota Vikings site. I co-host a podcast on there called Roughing the Podcast with another front page writer, Di Murphy. You can find us on Twitter. You can find the site at Daily Norseman. You can find me at Purple Buckeye. You can find my co-host Di at Di Murphy MN. And we will be on doing our podcast every week during the season, and we'll be posting stories throughout the year.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Again, Ted Glover with the Daily Norseman joining us. He's the editor over there, and he's doing a lot of good stuff. So even if it's for the weekend, follow him and check out the material that they have as the Bengals and the Vikings clash for preseason game number 1. Ted, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Hey, before I go,
yeah,
the Twitter handle for the podcast is at Rough the Podcast.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
Guys.
Yep.
You bet.